meetings, and this is, as I say, this is the first time, so hopefully it's going to be a successful event, which I'm sure it will be. I will chair the meeting, but our host is Alan, and Alan may, if we have any glitches, he will sort of help us out from time to time. So big welcome to Cathy, who's has already been to Nottingham and is known to us. Great to have you here tonight for your talk on the campaign to eradicate sweated labour, which is as pertinent today as it was all those years ago. Cathy's going to speak for about 40 minutes. There will be slides as well, so you'll need to move over to speaker view. We're also using chat. If people would like to type in any sort of comments or questions, that would be great, and I can read them out later. But I'm sure we'll also have scope to have individual voices as well. So don't feel that we're trying to suppress any comments or discussion. So if that's okay, Cathy, are you ready to go?
Yes, I am. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, pleasure, absolute pleasure. Now, just bear with me while I do the equivalent of walking over to the projector, and I have to go share screen, and I'm just going to get my slides up for you. And can you just, Alan, can the slides be seen?
Yes, they should be seen.
And can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, so happy for me to start?
Yeah, fine.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. And this evening I am, in fact, going to talk about the campaign to eradicate sweating in Britain in the early 20th century. Now, it was a successful campaign in that it led to new legislation. In particular, it led to the Trade Board Act of 1909. And that introduced a minimum wage initially into 4 of the worst paid industries in the country. And it was gradually extended so that by 1921, it covered 35 industries. A start it may have been, but I suppose in many ways, it must have been a very unsuccessful campaign if we judge it by the fact that the characteristics of sweating, as they were then defined, which were very low pay, poor working conditions and extremely long working hours, have, as Val said, not disappeared from the economy, and they remain a reality for far too many workers in Britain and around the world. Just a few weeks ago, Boohoo, described as a fast fashion brand, announced that its first half profits had soared by 51%. Now, there was an independent review into working conditions at the company, which concluded that Boohoo had capitalised on the commercial opportunities offered by lockdown, but at the same time had not taken enough responsibility for the consequences for those who were making the clothes that it was selling. The report found that not all workers were being properly compensated for their work. Many were being paid less than the minimum wage, that working conditions were poor, there were some violations of health and safety, and that not all workers were fully aware of their rights. Perhaps this wouldn't come as much of a surprise to anyone. Exploitation of workers is something that rears its head from time to time, and consumers become aware that the products that they want and that they buy, and I certainly don't exclude myself from this, are being produced in poor or even dangerous conditions. A great deal of production has been sourced abroad. We recall this fact, of course, when things go very badly wrong, such as they did in 2013 with the collapse of Rana Plaza near Dhaka in Bangladesh. And this made the headlines because it was such an appalling tragedy. Rana Plaza was a building which housed several ready-made clothing factories, and in the collapse, more than 1,100 people died. Now, 2 years ago, hold on. Bear with me, I'm trying to change my slide. Ah, there we go. I don't know why it stopped, but anyway. Yeah, 2 years ago, sorry, I was saying, Sarah O'Connor wrote an excellent article for the Financial Times, drawing attention to the so-called dark factories in Leicester, in which workers are paid well below the minimum wage, often working in small units within factory spaces no longer used for their original purpose. Machinery in those can be out of date, working conditions far from ideal. And Sarah O'Connor wrote an update to the article this summer. She explained that as a result of her 2018 investigations, she'd been invited to testify at a parliamentary select committee that heard about the costs of the fast fashion industry. The government rejected all of the committee's recommendations. So nothing much has changed. Profits increase. The government knows that abuses of labour continue, but there doesn't seem to be any political will to do anything about it. So when I hear the word sweating, I actually see the word hidden right next to it. And this is the reason, I think, why eradicating it has not yet happened. It encompasses too many jobs that we don't see being done: making clothes, cleaning, food preparation. And although none of these jobs are done exclusively by women, I think it's fair to say that women are disproportionately affected and suffer the consequences of all of the elements of bad labour conditions that existed over 100 years ago. Casual contracts, now we tend to call them 0 hours contracts, no sick pay, no holiday pay, and for too many working without the protection of a trade union. So on that depressing note, let's rewind to the 19th century. From at least the 1840s, there'd been attempts to raise awareness of sweated labour. The 1840s was, of course, the decade of Thomas Hood's famous poem, Song of the Shirt, with its opening verse. And when I read the opening verse, I also hear Sarah O'Connor's point about sewing machinists in the Leicester factories. And I recall this image, which was taken from the Chicago Sweated Industries exhibition in 1907, and then reproduced by the Woman Worker Trade Union Journal in 1907. With fingers weary and worn, with eyelids heavy and red, a woman sat in unwomanly rags, plying her needle and thread. Stitch, 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 in poverty, hunger and dirt, and still with a voice of dolorous pitch, she sang the Song of the Shirt. Sweated labour was brought to the government's attention in the late 1880s, accompanied by a great deal of talk and a lot of hand-wringing. A House of Lords committee defined sweating as unduly low rates of wages, excessive hours of labour, and insanitary state of workplaces. But despite being given a name, not much else was done. Nothing was preventing thousands of the most hidden of workers, often, but not always, outworkers, taking in work to do at home, from being exploited by employers seeking only to maximise their profits. Sweating was prevalent across many industries, both in people's homes and in factories. And rush orders often resulted in whole families being engaged in, for example, box making, including matchboxes, sack making, sewing beads onto shoes, making hairbrushes and umbrellas, belts and ties, covering tennis balls, stuffing toys, all sorts of jobs. And work that required glue to be heated or fur to be pulled were, as you can imagine, among the most odious jobs to be done within the home, causing significant health problems in living spaces with inadequate ventilation and space. Here we have a description by trade union leader Julia Varley of a family working together in a dark and ill-ventilated house. The table, she said, was filled with cards and buttons. 3 children and an old man sat with fingers flying up and down, scarcely a pause, as the buttons were stitched onto the cards. The investigator, who was a clergyman, with trembling voice, questioned the woman and found that she was hoping to have a good week. They were trying to finish the last lot, which, if done in time, would bring in 6 shillings for the week. Mother, 5 children, aged grandfather, a good week, 6 shillings. Father, when in full work outside the home, was paid 18 shillings a week, but he was delicate, had a weak chest, and was often ill. It's worth noting that even 18 shillings was a low rate of pay. The Board of Trade had put an average male labourer's wage in the early 20th century at about 25 shillings. Now, in 1895, the National Union of Women Workers held its annual conference in Nottingham. This organisation, despite the name, was not a trade union, so not to be confused with the National Federation of Women Workers, which I'll talk about later. Instead, it was a largely philanthropical middle-class organisation. And when it met in Nottingham, it did so in conjunction with the Nottingham Lodge of the Women's League for Mothers and Women in Positions of Responsibility. The aims of the National Union of Women Workers were broad. The Nottingham branch was typical in its promotion of the social, civil, moral and religious welfare of women and children. The conference agenda was varied, but there was serious debate about the best way to improve life for women industrial workers. Beatrice Webb speaking in favour of state legislation amidst debate at the conference about whether it was ever a good thing for rational women of any class to be legislated against in this way. Now, sometimes using the language of Christian duty rather than practicality, its concerns about the indignity of labour, the effects of poverty on people's lives are evident when you read this report, but as yet there was still no clear way forward. In addition, there were other national organisations, such as the Women's Industrial Council, researching, investigating, seeking solutions to the problems of overwork and underpay on women's lives in particular. Investigators looked at work that was needed on fashion or high-end goods, but for which workers were paid pennies. Intricate work that was much admired, but which was too often made in appalling conditions. The Birmingham Women Workers Organisation Committee found that in 1910, a very pretty child's dress of white cashmere with a smocked yoke, waist and wrists took 3 hours to make, and the worker received just 3¼ pence. There were also concerns about contracting diseases from goods made in workers' homes. This was the kind of thing that did make people sit up and take note. And this was brought home in drastic manner by trade union leader Mary Macarthur, as she's with Keir Hardie. And Macarthur was hospitalised after she'd visited a young woman who was making baby clothes in her home. At night, the woman who had diphtheria covered herself with the clothes that she was making in order to keep warm, and Macarthur contracted diphtheria from the visit. Kind of made people think, well, what then were the risks to the consumer? Was disease actually being stitched into the seams of the garments? Asked Macarthur's biographer in 1925. And coming back to Nottingham, what were wages like in the Nottingham lace trade, which was investigated in 1893 as part of the Royal Commission on Labour? Investigator May Abraham, who became one of Britain's first women factory inspectors, noted that the wages for women in the lace trade ranged from as little as 4 shillings a week for dressing lace to 24 shillings a week for making it up. But she emphasised that this maximum wage was only possible by those on piecework as opposed to time work, and presumably they were working as fast as they could and doing as many hours as they possibly could to get that sort of wage. Abraham noted that at the time of her investigation, work had been slack in the industry for a long time, and hardly any of the women that she examined were in regular employment. In addition, she found that much of the work that had been done in factories, such as scalloping, sort of finishing, was now being given to home workers at severely reduced prices. One factory owner stated that he had employed 50 women as scallopers in his factory, paying them 15 shillings a week. But now the work, as I say, largely finishing work, was currently being given out at 6 to 7 shillings a week. Conditions in some of the factories, she found, were also pretty bad, with women, as they did across the industrial, many industries, facing excessive fines, such as for lateness, being charged to warm up their dinners, being charged for going to the toilet, anything really that allowed bosses to pay out less. Now, in 1900, the Liberal MP Sir Charles Dilke had introduced a wages board bill, which sought to fix minimum wages in the very worst paid industries, but still no wider political will to advance it. He presented this report 5 years running, but it never got a second reading. Things, however, were beginning to change, because in 1906 came a new Liberal government. There were new faces in the House of Commons, some radical Liberal MPs, but also, and crucially, some Labour ones, including Keir Hardie and Will Crooks, placing emphasis on social reform, which in turn generated fresh interest in the anti-sweating cause. It came at a time of increasing national concerns that poverty was interfering with the health and therefore ability of a whole generation of workers who were needed to defend Britain and sustain its dominance of world trade. The extent of the problem was thrown into sharp relief by the fact that so many men were found not to be fit enough to fight in the Boer War. This was enough to convince a few people of influence to begin to see that the state must interest itself in those people described by Gertrude Tuckwell of the Women's Trade Union League as poor, scattered, and broken with incessant toil. Among many important influences on the debate was Mary Macarthur, who I mentioned earlier, a Scottish trade unionist who by 1906 was secretary of the Women's Trade Union League and founder of the all-female National Federation of Women Workers, which very much was a trade union. Very much a doer, Mary Macarthur spoke wherever and whenever she could about the realities facing workers, particularly women, in hidden industries such as chain making, garment making, and lace finishing. And she was adamant that the accepted term sweating was in fact inadequate to use when describing the worst of conditions, believing that actually most workers in Britain worked within the definition of sweating that the House of Lords had come up with in 1888, those long hours, low wages and poor working conditions. So Macarthur came up with her own term. She referred to the super sweated to distinguish and describe those in the very worst positions and therefore in need of the most urgent reform. Another important push towards reform came in 1906 with the organisation of an exhibition in London, put on with the help of the Liberal editor of the Daily News, A.G. Gardiner. At the Queen's Hall in Langham Place, the public could observe workers from 45 sweated trades going about their daily employment in stalls specially constructed to resemble home working conditions. The industrialist George Cadbury provided some of the funding and, most importantly, he paid participating workers for their loss of income and promised to defend them against any possible victimisation from their employers. Dismissed by some as nothing more than a fashionable social function, even the Daily News admitted that for some workers, for some visitors, the 1906 Sweated Industries exhibition in the Queen's Hall was no more than, quote, a painful interlude between a visit to the shops in the morning and the theatre in the evening. It was, however, a bold idea, and it created a powerful visual experience. Now, although we as a 21st century audience might recoil at the idea of well-off people paying an entrance fee to go and gawp at the poor, it does seem to have had an impact not dissimilar to that caused by the BBC screening of Cathy Come Home in 1966, which highlighted homelessness. The Women's Trade Union Review reported that people learned, numbers among them evidently for the first time in their lives, on what kind of foundation much of the industrialism of this country was resting. They drew near, half appalled, half fascinated, and saw and heard for themselves. They listened to the lectures that were given day after day by men and women who knew all that lay behind the work exhibited on the stalls. They asked questions and at least went away sorrowful to tell others of the things they'd heard and seen. And here and at subsequent exhibitions held in other British cities, visitors did watch with horror and dismay as workers made trousers, blouses, babies' bonnets, fancy aprons, umbrellas, artificial flowers, and confirmation wreaths. They saw shawls being fringed, ladies' shoes being beaded, lace being scalloped, books being folded, military insignia being embroidered. In addition to the long hours required to make just a few shillings, visitors began to understand that far from the work being done by a residuum of unskilled workers, much of this work was highly skilled and carried out by men and women who had perfected their abilities over years in order to churn out work by the piece as quickly and effectively as they could in order just to survive. Now, if we just go back to Nottingham for a moment, this is 2 years after the exhibition, the TUC Congress was held in the city. And there was much interest in the conditions of labour in the host city. The Guardian newspaper focusing on women's industrial work during what it called every stage of life. From the tiny schoolgirl, busily using her small fingers in the dinner hour to help the mother engaged in clipping. Then as an older girl, school days just about over, beginning her apprenticeship as a winder, and as a growing woman, carrying on the same business with increasing skill until unable to work any longer. In other words, work until you drop. A particularly vivid description of the pressures of home working in the lace industry come in this oral history account from a Nottingham woman who described her mother's work as a middlewoman in the outwork section of the trade. And this, for anyone who's interested, is held in the local studies library in Nottingham. She said her mum had to fetch the work from the workplace, bring it home and give it out to people. Used to be waiting at the bottom of the street for her. They knew what time she'd be back and they all wanted to see what Mrs. So-and-so had got, you see. They all needed the work, so they all wanted to be there in case somebody got a bit more than them. Understand what I mean? She went on to paint the scene in her mum's house that evening, with the finished work due back the next day. Even though she was a middlewoman on commission, she still needed to take on some of the work herself. It came from the factory in one long piece, and all the women would come to her house to work at separating it out, so that they could then take their own portion home to work on. The table got pushed back to the wall, and she recorded her mum yelling, "Mind my ornaments," as the women's hands flew to get the work done. As soon as it was, they would all go home, and returned the finished work the next morning when it was bundled into a large piece of cloth, ticketed so that it was clear who'd done what, and returned to the factory. So working in small houses, surrounded by family, one of the biggest challenges was keeping the lace clean, for fear that the work would be rejected by the employer or that there would be fines. So there could be no tea spills, no soot, no grease, no marks from inquisitive toddlers. And of course, the work went on unabated until it was done, at the same time as looking after the family, feeding husbands who were lucky enough to be in work. In other words, then, the work pattern was frenetic, it was erratic, not knowing for sure when there'd be work, and it took over the entire house until it was out the door the next morning. Whilst employers then saved on overheads and just waited for the miracle of labour to perform and deliver the goods. Now, it's worth noting about this account that the woman talking wasn't born herself until 1912. And so she's talking about the years after the First World War, after the introduction of legislation in the lace finishing sector to regulate wages. It's the kind of example perhaps that we need as a reality check all the while when talking about reform in the 20th century. We'll go back then to what happened after the Sweated Industries exhibition in 1906. The first thing that happened was the formation of the National Anti-Sweating League, which was intended to keep up the pressure on government for reform. There were often differences of opinion amongst reformers and activists over the best way forward. There were those like Ramsay and Margaret MacDonald who feared that setting a minimum wage would merely depress wages at those levels for all time. Whereas others, including Mary Macarthur, felt that a minimum wage was at least a starting point. And more than that, it might at the least remove the utter desperation that led to many workers concluding that it would be easier to starve without the work than to starve with it. And that crucially, if legislation was accompanied by a drive to organise workers into trade unions, their position would be further strengthened. There were also those who just wanted to see the abolition of all outwork. And at one union conference, Mary Macarthur, who was very definitely a pragmatist, implored delegates to remember that this was not the point of the debate. Yes, it would be great to see the end of sweated work. What they needed to work out was how sweated industries could be raised to a standard which would pay workers enough to live in decency and comfort. Of course, we're all socialists, she said. And of course, socialism was ultimately the only solution to every labour problem. But can we please just focus for now on the worst evils of sweating, one step at a time? The efforts to put pressure on government resulted in the setting up of a select committee on homework in 1907, because it was within homework that the worst abuses were reckoned to occur, where workers were subject to the worst exploitation and intimidation because they were isolated, either collecting or work or having it delivered to their door, the materials, in other words, to produce the work, to be paid at piece rates, meaning always working at breakneck speed. Mary Macarthur was one of many witnesses called to provide evidence to the committee. She brought 7 workers to appear before the all-male panel, who first wanted to check that she'd not selected sample horrible cases. Assurance given, she explained the importance of the women's anonymity and their need to give their testimonies in private so that their employers didn't find out. This alone could not, Mary stressed, fully reassure the brave women who, although attending willingly, were still very nervous about it. She was having none of the patronising tone adopted by the panel members, who voiced assumptions that the women must be very excited by attending the proceedings. The women, she said, were interested and nervous. They were not excited. The testimonies they gave outlined the unpredictability of their pay and the extreme vulnerability in the face of employers who knew how completely dependent home workers were on them. However many years of experience you might have, no matter how many expenses you incurred or how much skill you displayed, the response was always the same, summed up by one woman: you must take the work or you have the sack. If you don't take what they offer you, they tell you to go. They can always get other workers. The Select Committee's final report recommended the establishment of trade boards to safeguard the payment of legally enforceable minimum wages. When this finally became law in October 1909, 4 of the worst paying sweated industries were selected as test cases. The boards, made up of representatives of employers, workers, and state-nominated independent persons, were established in paper box making, wholesale and bespoke tailoring, machine-made lace finishing, and chain making. The first to begin work on the introduction of a minimum rate was the Chain Making Board, representing an industry which was largely based in and around Cradley Heath in the Black Country. The story of the chain makers' struggle to actually get the rate that they were promised is in equal measure inspiring and depressing, so I'll do my best to summarise it here. What the chain makers' experience shows most of all, I think, is the lengths that employers would go to in order to keep their labour costs as low as possible. Mary Macarthur was part of the chain makers' board. In May 1910, after 3 months' negotiations, it finally agreed upon a rate, but it fell considerably lower than what Mary Macarthur had hoped. She accepted it with reluctance as a basis for future improvement, but she was also in the knowledge that it would raise hundreds of women's weekly wages by as much as 70 to 100%. Celebrations and the pay rises, however, weren't about to start anytime soon. First, there was a 3-month period before the agreement was enforceable. Then there was a 6-month period in which workers could contract out of the new rates. Implausible though it sounds that any worker would agree to do this, the nature of sweating made it easy for employers. They came up with a form so that women could sign their agreement to work at the lower rates. And many did so, unsure of the right way to proceed or of what they were being presented with, being told by the middlemen that this was the only way future work could be guaranteed. By no means all the women who signed could read or write with ease, and many were easily taken advantage of. It wasn't like a form going around a factory. This was taken from doorstep to doorstep, and individual women were left in no doubt that if they didn't take the work offered, there were plenty who would. The employer's hope was that if they paid the workers at the old rates and at the same time stockpiled as much chain as they possibly could, creating a market glut, they could then at the end of that 6-month period, lay workers off and claim that the Trade Board Act had caused widespread unemployment. They reckoned, however, there's just another image there, without Mary Macarthur, there she is again, and her union, the National Federation of Women Workers, because they demanded the immediate payment of the new rates. When women who refused to work for lower rates were locked out by employers who refused to deliver the materials they needed to make the chain, the Federation began a strike for the minimum rate. Hundreds of Cradley Heath women either cancelled the contracts they'd signed or refused to sign at all. The trouble was that the Federation, a very small still and a very young trade union, didn't have the funds to sustain a long dispute. Moral support, encouragement, galvanising talk were all well and good, but without financial assistance, the workers would be easily defeated. The only way that the National Federation of Women Workers could hope to keep the women out was to appeal to the public. And so a campaign to raise money was masterminded by Mary Macarthur, and it worked a treat. Macarthur worked the press so effectively that very few people in Britain remained in ignorance about the women's plight. And she made sure that the situation was widely regarded not simply as a labour dispute, but more as a humanitarian crisis. And this helped to bring in money from people who wouldn't have dreamt of supporting anything that might have been exploited by some upstart militant trade union full of women. The public was incensed to learn that the wages owed to the women were theirs by right. The government said so, and the attempts made to bully them out of it were met with righteous indignation. Money poured in from home and abroad in response to emotive press appeals. From brilliantly staged collections, chained women appeared on public platforms. They went to football grounds, standing on the pitch before and after games with bedsheets so that the crowd could throw money onto them. Overall, enough money was raised to give strike pay to union and non-union members alike. One journalist noting the sad fact that this actually made many of the women better off than when they were working, getting four or 5 shillings, I think it was, strike pay. The relentlessly bad publicity that was heaped upon the chainmakers of Cradley Heath led to more and more employers signing the so-called whitelist of agreed prices. It must have infuriated proud company owners to hear Cradley Heath being described as hell and middlemen as parasites. Even worse, hundreds of thousands of people got to see this hell for themselves when Mary Macarthur arranged for a Pathé News film to be made about the strike, which was seen in theatres and music halls across the country. It was a stroke of genius, turning public pity swiftly into financial help. The loud and insistent message from newsreel, newspapers, from people of influence was powerful. By the time the women had won their dispute and returned to work in late October, there was enough money left in the strike fund for the building of a workers' institute in Cradley Heath. And this building is now, for those of you who may have seen it, in the Black Country Living Museum, where it was removed about 10 years ago, I think, when it was threatened with demolition in Cradley Heath. The institute was intended to serve as a meeting venue for trade unionists seeking support, advice, and social activities, which was so crucial to branch unity, particularly when workers were so scattered. It was also a very powerful visual reminder of just what could be achieved with solidarity. So the strike was over. It was won, so surely no more shenanigans from many employers under the protection of the trade boards. Surely it was going to be plain sailing now. Mary Macarthur was acutely aware of the hard work that was now needed to make sure that there was no victimisation of workers. So there was excitement that the inclusion of the lace finishing trade in the Trade Boards Act would not just raise wages in Nottingham and surrounding area, but provide a real boost to trade union organisation among women workers. Its trade board was established in September 1910. The Anti-Sweating League and the National Federation of Women Workers held large meetings in Nottingham and confidently anticipated the formation of a branch of over 1,000 outworkers. Money was collected for the establishment of a central union office in town, which was again really important when outworkers were scattered with so little opportunity to meet other members or to see an organiser without the local employer getting to hear about it. So in 1911 or possibly early 1912, an office for the National Federation of Women Workers opened in Nottingham at 13 George Street, and a permanent, i.e. paid secretary, Miss Peters, was put in charge. campaigns in the city concentrated on trying to unite out workers. And whilst there were successes, it was hard work. The National Federation of Women Workers annual report of 1913 reported a big decrease in membership in spite of the minimum rates that had been fixed by the Trade Board. The union heard complaints of victimisation of union workers and payment of sometimes less than the set minimum rate, along with all sorts of deductions, just as there had been forever. With sadness, it concluded that it all pointed to a conspiracy on the part of certain manufacturers and middlewomen to defy the provisions of the Trade Board Act. So to finish, I'm sorry that, I start on a depressing note and I'm going to end on quite a depressing note as well. The Trade Board Act, I would say, was the result of a government with a commitment to social reform. Its reasons for reform may not have been as caring as we might hope for. In other words, the maintenance of a healthy workforce in order to keep Britain great, etc. But the consequences of low pay and bad working practices were, at least for a while, brought out of the shadows. There were minimum rates set. Some workers inevitably did benefit from these minimum rates. The legislation was the result of a coming together of liberal and socialist social reformers in and out of Westminster, who were able to work together to get things done. It wasn't enough, it was barely even a start, but it did happen. And as I said at the beginning, the number of trade boards increased. In 1921, there were 35 trade boards. You can see them here on the screen, just as an example. They were renamed wages councils in 1945. And then they were abolished under the Tories between 1986 and 1993. And it's not until 1999 that the first minimum wage in this country for all workers was introduced by Blair's government. There were arguments then, just as there were back in 1909, that it would cripple the economy. Others believed that the rate was set too low. The reality is that it did raise the wages of millions of workers, and many employers have been fined for non-compliance. It's obviously very far from being a fair or adequate wage, and that's evident in the distinction between a minimum wage paid to the under 25s and a living wage paid for those over 25. There are also campaigns in London for the London living wage in recognition of the higher living costs in the capital, paid by some employers, but not compulsory. So the challenges today are immense, and too much, I think, is still hidden. A bad contract is a bad contract, and we can't let the government excuse them away because they say that 0 hours contracts offer flexibility and therefore the workers like them. We can't have a government ignoring those workers who are still not being paid a minimum wage. And we need the trade union movement as much as ever, if not more. Wherever work is hidden, wherever wages are the lowest, things still need to get much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That was excellent, and particularly the visual material really sort of assisted. And I'm sure we're going to have some comments and questions. I'll just check on the chat. Nothing there, so I think we're going to be opening it up to the audience. Have we got any questions for Cathy?
This is where Zoom is really embarrassing.
Everybody back again?
There's no way
to see everybody.
Yeah, I'd like to ask make a point really connected with what Cathy said, please, Val?
Yes, please carry on, Hilary. Thank you.
Thank you. We all might take some sort of heart from the fact that it's now been identified that social care work, which usually has 12-hour shifts on minimum wage, is being a part of a campaign. There are all sorts of campaigns, from the National Pensioners Convention to GMB to Unison to Keep Our NHS Public and the Socialist Health Association. All sorts of organisations now are beginning to campaign for social care that is part of, that is produced publicly and owned publicly. Now, to get that latter thing, it's not going to be easy, and nobody's quite sorted out how. But one of the interesting things is that the wages are now being seen as part of the campaign, that the wages must be increased, training and job security must be increased, as well as the need for personal protective equipment, which was ignored in many cases during the beginning of the pandemic. The Women's Budget Group has done some research which points out that you could spend a certain amount of money on material infrastructure and it would create a certain number of jobs. But if you spent the same money on social care, it would actually create more jobs. So a number of organisations are now beginning to say this should not be seen as a drain on the public purse, but as part of the engine of getting the economy moving again. Because of course, if more women have better pay, they can pay taxes and spend more on basic things rather than jetting off to the Canaries were such a thing possible. So I think this is a continuation in a way of that same campaign, just in a different form. I don't know.
Okay, Cathy, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I completely agree. It's got to carry on beyond the pandemic. You're absolutely right. There's been awareness raised of the shocking low pay in social care, but the voices need to be joined up. And it is very similar to how they weren't, I tried to show at the beginning of the talk that they were coming, there were voices coming, and people were horrified, but without the political will, without it being joined inside and outside of Westminster, it just carries on. And so we've all got to do something, but and it's pressure, it's keeping up the pressure and making sure that things don't slide and disappear and go back to being hidden again, because when they're hidden, then nothing gets done. So, yeah, I agree.
Okay, thank you. Roger, coming in.
Yeah, first of all, that was an excellent talk. I found it really interesting. And I was very pleased by the way that at the beginning and at the end, you did bring it from the conditions and problems today back to those conditions and problems. And I want to pick up one of those, because I think one of the things that struck me in the examples you were giving was, first of all, quite respectability of the houses. These were houses like my grandparents' house, a nice terraced house with the best room. And I'm sure whether they normally worked in those rooms, I'm not sure, but it definitely was, there were classic Victorian and Edwardian rooms. Second one is that because of this issue of home working, it's now become a major issue again with COVID, that people are working at home. And initially there was quite a lot in the press of people saying how wonderful that was and how liberating it would be to work at home. I think the reality is very much relating to some of the issues that you raised, which is about health and the impact on people of having to work in isolation. And although we might not have as many jobs where there's dust, if you're stuck on a computer all day, then that brings its own problems of mental health. and I think that it moves into different areas. And I was struck finally by the statement of poor, scattered and broken by toil. I think we can relate that to lots of people who are scattered and broken by conditions of working in homes.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree.
Cathy, do you want to come back? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just to say, I completely agree on the first point, the respectability. And I think that, you know, that was what I think really shocked people, that they thought, well, you know, as I said, this wasn't just a residual cause, it was how people work. This was how high-class goods were being produced in people's homes, and trying to keep everything going, trying, you know, the women in the double shift all the time, keep the home going. Husband in work, if there, you know, if the husband was able to work, if there was a husband, woman trying to make ends meet by doing what she could, but it taking over the entire home, which moves on to the second point about today and home working. You know, what about, we still need to be asking questions about overheads. I mentioned about employers in the early 20th century not having to pay overheads. Well, you know, are people going to be working this winter in cold conditions because they can't afford to put the heating on, you know, and regards mental health, in absolutely, if you're isolated and you're not with people who are doing the same sort of work as you, it's, you know, this is yes, you're absolutely right. And then poor, scattered, broken with toil, yes, absolutely.
Super, thank you. I think we've just got a bit of background noise, Alan. Is that people need to mute?
People need to mute their microphone when they're not speaking.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you pick up all sorts of background noise. So if people could keep muted when they're not speaking.
Okay, I think we've got, it's not Phyllis, I think, is it? Yes, Phyllis, yeah.
Phyllis, just thinking about education and labour movement involvement or presentation in education, and what's happening to our children and what's happening to our university students at the moment, and how little, as we know in the Labour History Society, how little of our labour movement history is taught to the younger generations and passed on, and with the sort of demise of the WEA and the lack of labour movement history being taught by the trade unions, we're in a decline or a spiral, downward spiral, aren't we really, in terms of letting people know of their own history, of that history of struggle and how we've arrived at the point we've arrived at, and the bravery and struggles that have gone on before. So I'm just wondering whether what we can do about this, and whether this is something we can raise with our trade unions through our branches. There was recently in the newspapers, wasn't there, that I gathered that a decree has gone out from the government that in schools they must not be taught about any other systems other than capitalism. So you can't know about or hear about socialism or communism. So there is an issue here of a campaign that maybe perhaps should come from the trade unions, because trade union history isn't taught in schools, as we know, or the good work that's done that Gwyneth did, for instance, in the work and the books that she produced. So for children. So and of course there are many other examples. So I just think this is something that maybe through our trade unions and maybe through perhaps our Labour Party branches, if we're members of the Labour Party, that this is something that we need to have a campaign about, to bring to schools and to universities labour movement history, in order that the struggles, the sort of excellent presentation we've had from Cathy, and in a different form for children can be brought to different generations.
Thanks, Phyllis. I'm sure that we'll all agree with that. But Cathy, did you want to come back in response?
Just to say, I totally agree, but I think there are two different points. One, I think, is trade union history seems for many reasons to have fallen out of favour. You're absolutely right. It isn't thoroughly, well, it's certainly not, I shouldn't think, taught in schools, although I was very heartened when I went to launch my biography of Mary Macarthur in Cradley Heath, and all the children that I spoke to in that day, when some schools came into the library, all knew about the chain making industry. And I think that points to a need for us still to be recording, not necessarily so perhaps, well, yes, about trade unions, but specifically about labour, about what people have done and how they've done it, and how they've lived their lives. I mentioned earlier that report in Nottingham. I don't know if any of you have ever used the oral history accounts in Nottingham, but I came across them by accident really one day, and this is just wonderful stuff, and we need more of it. And that's the only way, if we talk to people and encourage people to write about their work, write about their lives, and we do it now, and we do it, and we get a picture of what's going on during this extraordinary year as well. Then we can put it together. Then we can put it out to people to share with children, because children are interested. They do want to know. So I think it's trade union history and how we can preserve that, but it's also the history of labour, and how change has come or not come, change in continuity, I suppose.
Thanks, Cathy. Have we got, yes, Maggie, are you coming in?
Yes, thank you. I don't know whether you're aware, and this is a little bit on the side, but a few years ago, people who worked at Raleigh in Nottingham were invited to, contribute to, I think it was a University of Nottingham project, where ex-workers of Raleigh, old workers of Raleigh, were asked to describe what the conditions were like and what their experiences were like of working at Raleigh. And my partner Paul was one of those people, and I think somewhere on the internet that set of interviews is available for people who would like to hear more about that aspect of working.
Thank you.
Super. Have we got any more? Yes, Steve, and then Helen.
Yeah, just on that point, there's also a very good archive of Britain at Work that is on the TUC, held by the TUC. I think you can get to it through the website. Some brilliant interviews that were done in London from people at work since the Second World War, and there's a book as well that's produced. And there was a project that ran for a number of years on that. So there are some other good examples around. I've got a question for Cathy as well. I was interested in how the industries were decided, which ones were brought into the trade board structure, and what the attitude of other unions was, and whether they favoured that or whether they attempts to organise independently and get agreements within sectors were seen to be a better route in certain industries than others. I'm just interested in what criteria were used.
The criteria for the first four were that they were seen to be the worst paid in the home working industries. So that was the criteria for the very first four. And the idea behind the trade boards was that there were representatives from trade unions as well as employers. But it was, yeah, it was quite, and there was quite a lot of debate, as I said. I said very briefly. Those who thought that actually it would deter trade union membership, to those who thought that it was a good way of actually reaching people because you could work with them to make sure that the terms and conditions of the trade board were going to go ahead. So it was unclear as you know, across the sector. But of course there weren't that many. If we're talking about women workers, there weren't, before the First World War, there weren't all that many trade unions organising amongst women industrial workers. The National Federation was one, the Workers' Union was another. So it was pretty untested. And as the union reports show, at the very beginning of the trade board legislation anyway, there was still victimisation. You know, it didn't necessarily make it easier, but it was generally seen as a way that you could unite workers. But you know, there was a long way to go.
Okay, thanks for that, Helen.
Yes, I just wanted to go back to something you said, Cathy, about women who used to work in factories or workshops being kind of pushed out to doing homework where they got a lot less pay. And I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that. Was there a general move? I mean, the big lace warehouses in Nottingham, for instance, I believe in the 19th century had lots of women doing the sort of finishing and things like that on the upper floors. Was there a move sort of later on and in the early 20th century to get those women out of the workplace and into the home? And was that mainly so they could pay them less, or was there a recognition that it was much more difficult for them to organise if they were home workers?
That's a very good point. I don't know enough about the Nottingham industry to be able to answer that very in any depth. I think from what I concluded from the 1893 report into labour, it was that when times were, it was a way of employers to save money when trade was bad. It was also a way for women who couldn't go out to work to continue to be able to work in the home. So it was, you know, there was an awareness from employers that there was a need for outwork. So I'm no doubt it was exploited by employers for that very reason, knowing that there'd always be women who and girls who would take this work. And it also kind of, you know, that point that I raised that I made that was in the Guardian in 1908 during TUC week, that there were different stages of women's lives. So, you know, as a girl, you'd be helping in the home with your mum. Then you do your own apprenticeship in a factory. You may continue there until you were married or until you had children. You may continue after that. But but there was the opportunity for you to be working at home. I don't know what the broader pattern was, I have to confess, in Nottingham, and I'm still kind of doing some research on the Nottingham lace industry. I tried to use as many examples because I knew I was talking to a Nottingham audience, but I can't say that I know for sure, but I think it's kind of probably a combination of those two things.
Thanks.
Super. Anne, are you coming? Yes? Just need to, okay.
Yes, I find it very fascinating. When I used to work for a living before going into teaching, I worked in the knitwear industry, and in Mansfield it was a number of big factories, and we were highly organised. I was the chair of the union committee at our place. There were 288 in the factory and 286 in the union. And where outwork was done, it might be that someone was off ill or there's a family problem, and work would be taken to
Right.
the person's house and then collected when they'd done it. But that was paid for at the same rate as it was if she had been to work.
Right.
In the Leicester situation, this is not the case. It's possible that where, you know, the minimum wage was £8 a week and £80 an hour, and now it's gone up to £8.25, but the boss missed it. It is not possible, as we've had examples in Leicester, where Asian women are paid £3.50 an hour, and it needs more than the trade unions, which barely seem to exist now in that industry. But the law being applied, and the person responsible for doing that, to have the financial consequences. And if you've got some self-important bastard who's doing that and knows what he's doing, and he gets his house confiscated in order that the workers can be reimbursed, then that's a problem he brought upon himself.
Okay.
Thank you.
Cathy, do you want to come back on that? And there was a question as well come through on chat. Can everybody see that question?
I did see it, but it's disappeared. Oh,
okay. Yeah, it's really sort of. Do you have any feelings on how the utopian socialists viewed the gender relationships?
Can I ask for a bit more?
Claire, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, I can come in on that. That's fine.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Good.
Thank you.
Hiya.
Hello.
Yes, I'm working on a project with the university at the moment. I'm working with utopian socialism and the trade union side of things. And I find obviously, I think that more to do with the political side is how women were suppressed, whereas the utopian socialists tended to try and build a relationship with women. Is that something that you feel?
I think that there was a tension between, in all of these different organisations, there was a tension between those who believe that women ideally shouldn't be working at all and should be were being exploited, were being forced out into having to work, and it would be better if you raised men's wages to stop women having to work at all. There was certainly this element. There were also those who believe that there should be legislation to make sure that women were protected in the workplace. Others who thought that if you didn't legislate against men in the workplace, then it was unfair to legislate against women in the workplace. There were all sorts of different tensions about what a woman worker, who a woman worker was, whether she, and of course I suppose the overriding image of a woman worker was of a young single woman who was working between leaving school and getting married, and the reality, of course, was very, very different to that. But she was very much a hidden worker. That women left work when they got married was not the case, as we've seen from all the work that was needing to be done. So I think because I'd say that in terms of the utopian socialists, there were those who, like Mary Macarthur, believe that nobody should be forced to work unless they had to, and the male trade unionists believing that women were taking labour from men at the factory gates, so that there shouldn't be a competition between the two. So I don't know if that's answering your question, really.
Yeah, I think it's opening a lot more, to be honest with you.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's what I thought. Sorry.
Anyways, no. Claire, you'll have to tell us a bit more about your project in due course.
Oh, I certainly will, yes. I'm not going to take the time up now, but I just wondered if anybody else had any views on it, but there you go.
Thank you. We've got time for just, I think, perhaps a couple more, but if they're quite short. Ian, are you coming in for a short one? Short question or comment?
Yeah, short and sweet. It was following up on utopian socialists. would that be the Women's Guild, the Cooperative Women's Guild? Because that was my understanding, they were a fairly influential forum where women could, you know, meet in collectively and negotiate all sorts of things and develop a communal collective atmosphere connected to co-op societies, but very much, you know, gender-based and fairly politically active too. I just wondered whether you'd come across in relationships with trade unions and stuff.
Is that for Claire or is that for me? Claire, do you want to answer that?
Well, for both of you, really.
Okay, Claire.
Hello again. I keep turning my microphone off. I don't want to cause any problems. I think that with the cooperative side of things, it's kind of takes you back to a bit further back to the Chartist idea when the boycotts of shops. It was the women that instigated that within Nottingham, to actually boycott the shops that wouldn't support the Chartist movement. And to me, it's a symbolism that comes from Crane and people like Bernard Partridge of what the woman is supposed to be. You know, the very feminine, and then go to Morris and everybody else. There's so many things going around in my head, and I've been listening to you tonight, Cathy, and it's kind of that changed it out, you know, like you say, it is so complicated. I think I might leave that one to you for now, if that's all right.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, again, I suppose what I was saying earlier when I was answering Claire's question is that I suppose the Cooperative Women's Guild were, you know, it was to encourage women to get out of the home, to learn meeting confidence without men being there, so that they had, and they very, very much had, you know, a socialist agenda as well. There was support from the cooperative movement to often Cooperative Women's Guild members would come out and work with trade union women, Women's Trade Union League, the National Federation of Women Workers. You know, there was such a crossover between all these organisations, the Women's Labour League, the Cooperative Women's Guild. Mary Macarthur was involved in all of them. And there was, sometimes they did have very traditional views, as I've said, about, you know, what a woman's place was to be. But the trade union movement, I think, was much more pragmatic. It did believe that this was the situation. Hundreds of thousands of women have to work, whether we like it or not, whether anybody likes it or not. And we need to make those conditions better. You know, I made that point about us saying, come on now, people, we're all socialists. We know what we want. We know we want to get rid of capitalism. We know that, you know, but in the meantime, you know, we've got to make life better for as many people as we can. And I think that it was very much an evolution. The trade boards, they clearly didn't work terribly well, but they did raise wages for people. The trade union movement did manage through the trade board legislation to reach some more workers. So, you know, it's a tricky one, because I didn't, you know, I started the talk on a depressing note and I ended it on a depressing note. But the thing is, there was change. There was will to do something. We can't, you know, we might not like, for example, the language of the National Union of Women Workers in Nottingham in the 1890s. We may find it a bit, you know, they're portraying women as victims and helpless, and they can't, you know, they need rescuing. But everybody was kind of moving towards the right, you know, to a solution to what was clearly exploitation, indignity of labour. All of that had to change, and we're still working on it, but we've got to keep it. All these organisations tried and still try to make sure that it isn't hidden. It's never going to go away unless it's out there all the time.
Super. Okay, if that's all right with everybody, I'm going to sort of bring it to a close now. Thanks again to Cathy for an excellent sort of session. I mean, the input and answering all the questions, and also for giving us the confidence as a society to actually try our hand at at another one of these Zoom meetings, which, you know, I think has worked really well. A big thanks to Alan for facilitating this and keeping us all on the right page, so to speak. And if anybody's interested, the poster gives details of how you can join our society. But it's a big thanks again to Cathy. Thank you for your time and for your talk.
Pleasure. And can I just say, there's a question from Claire to everyone. It says, hello, Cathy, do you have, oh no, not that one. Somebody was asking if I gave talks to trade union branches and labour branches. Yes, if you ask me. yes, certainly I will. If that's from Phyllis, I think. I'm happy to talk.
Lovely, and we hope to see you again soon, Cathy.
Hope so.
Hopefully at one of our meetings where we'll all be there, sat in front of you.
Yeah,
lovely. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me. Okay.
Brilliant. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.